Content warning. The Matherson Marriage contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and fictional domestic abuse. If you are in a real-life Matherson marriage, please reach out to the appropriate authorities for help. Resources you may find helpful include the Pixel Project's Domestic Violence Resource page and UN Women's International Helplines list. Resources will be linked in the video description for accessibility. Content warning for this chapter. This one is a bit heavy on the period-typical sexism as well as the unhealthy relationship dynamics. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 12. It's the darlingest, duckiest place I've ever seen, Violet declared enthusiastically. She was standing at the hall door of Chiswell's the following evening beside Ramsden, looking out over the old-fashioned garden. There was a tall, stiffly cut yew hedge down one side of the winding path that led to the road, and a wide bed of tall blue delphiniums on the other. Pansy never told me how lovely it was, she went on excitedly. It wasn't in such good order as this when your sister was here, Lynn said, and his thoughts flew back to that morning when Pansy had asked him for the puppy, for Buster, and Basil had refused to allow her to have it. Lynn had kept that puppy merely because Pansy had fondled it, and had christened it Tom Tinker to amuse Buster. We'll say it's really yours, he told the child once, only it will still live here with me because your father doesn't want any dogs in your home, see? Buster nodded solemnly. Secret, he whispered. Only us know. You and me. Tom Tinker was lying on the path now, his soft brown eyes fixed adoringly on Lynn, and when presently he turned back into the house, the dog followed. Matherson and his wife were in the hall, talking to the Jogsons, who had come down for the weekend. They were old friends of Lynn's. I've known them almost as long as I've known you, he told Violet when she asked about them. It seems a shame to stay in the house, Mrs. Jogson declared when dinner was over. It's quite warm. Can't we go into the garden? She slipped a hand through Lynn's arm and led him a little way from the others. Lynn, isn't Mrs. Matherson too pretty for words? She asked enthusiastically. Maurice thinks her sister is the better looking, but I don't. I think Mrs. Matherson is just perfect. Who are they? Lynn looked away. Matherson has a place about 3 miles away. Green Gables, they call it. I knew Mrs. Matherson and her sister years ago. We were all young together. Mrs. Jogson laughed. Young together? How old are you now, pray? 60? I feel 100 sometimes. Of course. She looks rather too sad, Mrs. Jogson went on reflectively. And Lynn, I don't like her husband. Don't you? Why? She considered. He's got nasty eyes, she said at last. Ramsden laughed. That's a woman's argument. Very likely, but it's true. He's the kind of man who would be a brute if he really lost his temper. Violet came running after them. Mrs. Jagson, your husband and Basil want to play bridge. They say it's waste of time walking about the garden. I don't agree myself, but I suppose we must make ourselves pleasant. She looked up at Lynn with laughing eyes. Pansy won't play, so who'll make the fourth, you or I? She asked. You, of course, Lynn said quickly. He glanced at Pansy with a pathetic hope in his eyes, but she was not looking at him, and they all went back to the house together. Pansy sat down by the window, the sunset light playing about her hair, and took up a book. Oh, Pansy can't play, Matherson said when Mrs. Jogson offered to sit out in her place. She'd rather look at a book. But what about you, Ramsden? I'm going to show Mrs. Matherson the library now the decorations are finished, Lynn said. There was defiance in his voice. Pansy laughed. Indeed, you are not, she said. I'm much too tired. I'm going to stay here. He made no answer. He settled the others at the card table at the other end of the room and came back to her. Pansy's hand shook as she turned the leaves of the book. What a lovely evening, she said nervously. Lynn did not answer until, under cover of a sudden burst of laughter and argument that arose from the others, he said in a hard voice, What have I done, Pansy? She shook her head. She tried to laugh. Done what? nothing. What do you mean?" And then, as she met his eyes, her heart seemed to die within her, and she broke out in a little piteous whisper. "Oh, Lynn, I'm jealous, horribly jealous." The hot blood mounted slowly to Lynn Ramsden's face, and for a moment he turned his back on the room and looked down at Pansy with burning eyes. "Jealous?" he said, in a voice that was so quiet that it sounded ineffably weary. "I wonder if you know the meaning of the word, Pansy." Violet called to him imperiously. "Lynn, come here and tell me what I ought to go on this hand." Mrs. Jackson protested. "I won't allow that. No partnerships, Lynn." "Not at present," Matherson supplemented meaningly, and laughed as if he had said something very witty. Lynn strolled across the room and glanced down at Violet's cards, but he offered no advice, and little Mrs. Jackson, whose eyes seemed to be everywhere, said abruptly, "Are you wishing us all at the bottom of the sea, Lynn? You look most frightfully tired." He roused himself with an effort. "Tired? Of course not." He dragged up a chair and sat down beside Violet, and she at once entered into a running conversation with him until Matherson threw down his hand and declared he would not play any more. "Women spoil any game," he said. "Don't they spoil everything in life?" Jackson asked whimsically, with an affectionate look at his wife. "Some of them do," Matherson answered nastily. He was thoroughly annoyed. He rather fancied himself as a bridge player, and as a consequence of having his game ruined, as he chose to consider it, he sulked for the rest of the evening. Before 11 o'clock he declared they must go home. Pansy was relieved, but her heart sank again when her husband took her on one side and told her to ask Lynn and the Jacksons over to Green Gables the following day. "Sunday's deadly anywhere," he said. "Ask them for the whole day. It's only courteous." Pansy looked up at him in bewilderment. "Is it necessary? We hardly know them." "I know Ramsden, and I wish them to come." His eyes held a threat, and Pansy obeyed. She crossed the hall to Lynn at the open door. "We shall be very pleased if you will bring Mr. and Mrs. Jackson to us to spend the day tomorrow," she said. He looked down at her and quickly away again. "I've got to see you somewhere alone." "When?" he asked. "Anywhere, anytime." "Well, is it all fixed up?" Matherson asked at her shoulder. "Come over early, Ramsden, all of you." "Thanks very much." The car was at the door, and Matherson went out to it, grumbling because he said the lights were dull. "Gates has let those batteries down again," he complained. It seems to me, if you want anything done properly, you've got to do it yourself." He grumbled all the way home. Jackson was a poor sport, he said. The idea of expecting a man to play for 5 pence a 100. "Perhaps they're not very well off," Pansy ventured. "Then they shouldn't play at all," he answered flatly. When they reached the house, he followed her upstairs. "You annoyed Ramsden again tonight," he told her. "Why the devil couldn't you have gone with him to look at the library when he asked you? Rude and tactless, I call it. Anyone with half an eye could see how annoyed he was. You made a feeble enough excuse, too. How could you be tired? Why, you do nothing from morning till night but enjoy yourself." Her eyes flamed into anger as she looked at him. "You wished me to go?" she asked. "Wished it? Of course I wished it. Hadn't I told you to make yourself agreeable to him? I thought I cured you of this nonsense. Any more of it, and I'll keep my threat of sending Buster to school." Her pale lips quivered. "Very well," she said quietly. "In future, I'll do anything Mr. Ramsden asks me to do." She went to her room, and Matherson returned to the library and mixed himself a whiskey and soda. He felt pleased by her submission. That was the way to manage a woman, he told himself complacently. It always paid to show them who was master. He rang up several other people on the phone the following morning and asked them to tea, not in the least because he wished for their company, but because he knew Pansy did not. "We should be buried alive if you had your way," he said to her when she expostulated. "I like plenty of life myself. I'm not at all sure that I shan't sell this place and take a house in London." He said that to annoy her, too, knowing quite well that she preferred the country on account of Buster. But if nobody else was pleased by the sudden influx of visitors, Violet thoroughly enjoyed herself. Everything was new to her. In Ledstow we never saw anyone but the curate, and the doctor, and the Miss Phipsons, and the postmistress, and the man who brought the milk round. My dear, it's heaven to have a man like Lynn on the spot. Pansy, don't you think it's rather extraordinary he's never got married? A man as good-looking as that. I don't know. Why should he? Violet laughed. Perhaps fate's reserved him for me, she said saucily. That was in the afternoon when tea had been brought out into the garden, and Joyce, standing by, looked up quickly at Pansy, but her face conveyed nothing. Buster was chasing Lynn in and out of the chairs grouped under the trees, and presently he caught him with a yell of delight at his own cleverness. "Run faster'n you," he shouted. "Run much faster'n you." "Sit down and be quiet, Buster," his father ordered. "Children seem to think they can monopolize the whole of the conversation nowadays," he complained to Mrs. Jackson. "He's a darling," the little woman answered quickly. "I wish he belonged to me." Pansy heard her and looked up with sympathetic eyes. "He's my greatest treasure," she said eagerly. "You ruined the boy," her husband commented. Pansy moved away without answering, and Lynn got up deliberately and followed her back to the tea table. He stood beside her for a few moments, talking disconnectedly. Then suddenly he said, "When am I going to see you alone?" "I don't know. It's impossible. You know I can't." His face twitched. "I shall take the Jacksons home early tonight," he said after a moment, "and come back. I'll wait in the garden for you. Lynn, I can't. I shall wait there all night or until you come." Pansy's eyes were piteous. "I've never been deceitful in my life, Lynn," she whispered. "I know, and I'll never ask it of you again," he answered. He moved away, and for the rest of the evening he devoted himself to Violet. "Is it a case between your sister and Mr. Ramsden?" Mrs. Jackson asked Pansy. "I think they'll make such a lovely couple if it is." "Yes, won't they?" Pansy answered. This was how it would always be. Always, always, she was telling herself in anguish, until some day Lynn would get weary of the hopeless waiting and leave her. Supper was rather an uproarious meal. There were 2 boys in the party who had taken an immediate fancy to Violet, and the 3 of them laughed and chaffed one another mercilessly the whole time. "The cheeriest evening we've had for months," Matherson said in a momentary lull. He looked across at his wife. "A little more youthful society would do you a world of good." Violet interrupted. "Heavens! Pansy's only a chicken herself," she said indignantly. "I tell you what, Pansy, we'll have dancing on the lawn after supper. There are heaps of us. Let me see. How many? 1, 2. Don't count me." Pansy interrupted. She felt ill and weary and totally unfit to join in the merriment. "There you are," Matherson struck in aggrievedly. "What in the world is the matter with you? You never used to be so dull. Why can't you dance, pray?" Pansy flushed sensitively. "Who wants to dance with me?" she said, trying to laugh. "You're always telling me to settle down. And remember, I'm a married woman, so I thought I'd better be staid and sit out. Mrs. Jackson looked towards the window. "Well, there's no need to argue," she said. "None of you will be able to dance because it's raining." Violet gave an exclamation of disappointment. "What a shame! Oh, how horrid! Isn't that too bad? Pansy, if you look pleased, I'll murder you." "Pleased?" Pansy raised her gray eyes. "I'm not pleased," she said, and she looked down the long table to Lynn Ramsden. Unless the rain stopped, she would not see him tonight, she knew, and sick disappointment tore at her heart, even while she knew she ought to be glad, for what was the use of such a meeting? It could only mean further heartbreak and sorrow. By 10 o'clock the rain was a steady downpour, and a chill breeze was blowing the trees and hedges this way and that in wild confusion. "We'd better start home before it gets worse," Lynn said. Some of the others had gone already, and Mrs. Jackson rose at once to fetch her coat and hat. "We've had a perfectly lovely day," she told Pansy. "You lucky woman! You don't know how I envy you." "Do you?" Pansy smiled wanly. "I think a good many people do," she added with a touch of bitterness. Lynn snatched a moment with her in the hall. "Fate's against us," he told her. "I shan't come back tonight, Pansy. You couldn't come out. You'd take your death of cold." Her cheeks burned as she looked up at him. "I don't care," she said recklessly, "but I do. I'll find some other way." He crushed her hand in his and turned away as Matherson came into the hall. The rain was coming down in sheets as they left the house. "I ought to have brought the big car," Ramsden said vexedly, "but who would have thought it meant to turn out like this?" Pansy looked back into the house. "What a pity it's so wet," she said. "Rain was wanted," Matherson answered. "The gardens are dried up." Pansy bit her lip. She knew that had she said rain was wanted, he would have told her not to talk such nonsense. He followed her into the drawing-room. "By the way," he said casually, "I'm going to town again tomorrow, and I'll take you with me if you like." Pansy felt herself paling. She began a hurried excuse. "I don't think I'll come. There's Buster, you see. He'll be happy enough with Violet. I can't very well leave her, can I? She'll think it unkind." Matherson looked at her steadily. "Why don't you speak the truth and say you don't want to come?" he asked. He put his hands on her shoulders. "What's come between us?" he asked with a sort of suspicion. "You've changed. I've noticed it for a long time." She tried to laugh. "What nonsense! Of course I haven't. It's you who imagines things." "Is it? I wish I could be sure." He stood looking at her for a moment. Then suddenly he drew her into his arms. "I'm sorry if I've been a bear lately," he said in halting apology, "but I've been worried about business affairs." She tried not to shrink from him. "Have you? I'm sorry. You didn't tell me. I hope it's all right now." "I think it's going to be." He put his hand beneath her chin and tilted her face back. "We'll go to town tomorrow and have another honeymoon, shall we?" he asked. She made a last desperate appeal. "Why not wait till later on? Why not go next month? Most of the theaters are closed now. London's dull at this time of year." He laughed. "There's plenty of amusement," he said. "Pack up your fallals, and we'll catch the early train, shall we?" "Yes, if you like." She tried to escape from him. "I'll tell them to have breakfast early." But he held her fast. "Kiss me. What a little iceberg you are!" But she turned her face away when he would have kissed her lips, and he only touched her cheek. He looked after her in a puzzled way as she left the room. Women were queer, he thought. Poor Pansy. Perhaps he had been rather snappy with her lately. In his own way, Matherson loved her well enough. "I'll buy her some more diamonds," he told himself. Like a great many men, he made the mistake of thinking that to a woman diamonds can make up for anything. And that is the end of Chapter 12 of The Matherson Marriage by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope that you have a great day. Bye!